Start? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vice Mayor Devereaux. I'll quickly read the call of the meeting and get the housekeeping stuff out of the way, and then we'll get started. So this is a meeting of the Government Operations Rules and Claims Committee. We're holding a hearing to discuss the logistics and feasibility of implementing early voting in city elections and to discuss the possibility of pursuing a home rule petition to lower the voting age in city elections to 16 years old. I should say that this meeting is being recorded for television and as well as privately recorded. And I will, I guess, first go around and introduce ourselves, then I'll make a few opening remarks. So, Councilor Carlone, this is Liz Walker, who's my aide.
I am Dennis Carlone, Councilor.
I'm Charlie Marquardt, Election Commissioner.
Tanya Ford, the Executive Director of the Election Commission.
Leslie Waxman, Assistant Director of the Election Commission.
Victoria Harris, Election Commissioner.
Arthur Goldberg, Deputy City Solicitor.
Sambal Siddiqui, City Council.
Quentin Zondervan, City Councilor.
Okay, thank you all for being here. So just briefly, we have two items on this agenda, and we don't have to divide the time evenly, and I know that the members of the Election Commission will need to scoot out a little early, so we'll talk primarily, I think, about the early voting earlier in the hearing, and then you'll be able to catch up by watching the video. So we had a home rule petition that we filed, which actually Liz and I and Sambal and her aide Sarah were at the State House this afternoon for a hearing of the committee, the joint committee that was looking at a number of different election reforms, including our home rule petition. So we testified for that. And that was regarding the early voting home rule petition that we filed at the end of last October. It got a very brief hearing at the end of the last term, didn't go anywhere, so now it's back on the agenda with a new number and, again, under consideration. So I think we all understand the value of early voting. We have early voting statewide in the even year elections, and the home rule petition was simply an effort to get the city the ability to offer it in our own municipal elections at the discretion of ultimately working out the details and the implementation between the Election Commission and the City Council. So we're basically with that home rule petition just looking for the power to do that from the state, and then we can talk about the details, but I do want to hear today from the Election Commission some of their at least initial thoughts about how that might work or not work, or what kinds of things we would need to be thinking about should that happen. Probably not this fall, given the timing, but 2 years from now. But in terms of youth voting, I'm excited because this could be third time could be the charm in this case. There have been numerous past efforts in Cambridge and other places to lower the voting age to 16 or 17. We've had 2 home rule petitions already sent to the State House, one in 2002 and one in 2006, to lower Cambridge's voting age to 17. And those efforts were led by many high school students in the city, including Councilor Siddiqui when she was at CRLS. We have some lovely old photos of her efforts at early efforts at civic engagement, so she can definitely tell us about that experience. I'll pass them around privately. There's also, I think Councilor Toomey is in one of them, and he looks younger too, but not quite high school age. There's new momentum nationwide to lower the voting age. In Congress, our new U.S. Representative, Ayanna Pressley, has sponsored a bill to lower the voting age to 16 in federal elections. And at the state level in Massachusetts, Representative Andy Vargas from Haverhill, who was planning to be here today but has gotten tied up at the State House with their budget discussions, along with Representative Dylan Fernandez from Falmouth and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, are the lead sponsors of a bill known as the Empower Act, which would allow all cities and towns in the state to change their minimum voting age to 16 if they wish. And we've just been informed by Rep. Vargas that there'll be a hearing on June 12th for that at the State House. And a number of other cities and towns in the state, including Northampton, Somerville, Marlborough, Newton, Boston, Shelburne, Ashfield, Lowell, and Worcester, have expressed interest in seeking permission to change their voting age to 16. Concord and Wendell currently have home rule petitions under consideration. So we know there's a lot of interest currently across the state, around the country. We've been getting emails, and I really hope we can have, a discussion today about whether we want to revive that. I don't probably need to spend a lot of time talking about, why it would be a good idea to empower younger people. They can be employed, they can pay taxes, they can have a driver's license, they can donate blood. They attend our schools that are impacted by the school committee decisions. And increasingly, young people have been stepping up to lead where we adults have failed, notably on issues like gun control, resiliency planning for climate change. And they also have a strong interest in youth and workforce development programs that, affect them in road safety, pedestrian and bike safety, and in the emerging, policy issues around surveillance technology, since they are the digital natives. Typically today, many of our residents turn 18, and some of them move away from home to go to school or for other reasons, and their first absentee ballot their first voting experience is with an absentee ballot, and at that age, they're really not as engaged in their local community as they were when they were living at home, and they just may not be that invested in the issues. So, in jurisdictions where there is a lower voting age, there's data that shows that the 16 and 17-year-old first-time voters consistently do turn out to vote at the higher rates than even the 18 and 19-year-old first-time voters. And there's evidence that starting voting younger forms a good habit of voting throughout their life. And the enthusiastic youth voters routinely encourage adults in their lives to go to the polling station too. So I think it's a win-win for us. We've done a small bit of research, and it appears that there may be about 17 to 1,800 total residents in the 16 and 17-year-old age group. Obviously, not all of them would register and show up to the polls, but it's a good number. So that is just to sort of set the stage. But then I think, in the interest of the Election Commission's time, I think I'd like to turn the conversation first to discussing a little bit about early voting and how that, in theory, could work, and what kinds of considerations you'd want to discuss among yourselves and with the council were it to be implemented in Cambridge for municipal elections. So I can put you on the spot, or I can call on either of my colleagues if there are any questions or thoughts. Entirely up to you.
Maybe we can start with some questions, because I think there are some concerns of the board, like the logistics and the implementation regulations, establishing regulations for early voting, which is substantial. I think that they're also concerned that, obviously, for this fall, should it be implemented, or that it just isn't enough time to go through the implementation process. I think that the board would like to have, to produce a draft copy, have a public comment period, a hearing of some sort, so that people can voice their concerns. I think we need to consider the...
Oh, yeah, actually, that if you spoke directly, and then, because we are being recorded, so
I think that there should be a concern about the costs.
Mm-hmm.
Costs will double from what we have now for workers and professional and technical services. The ballots, are concerned with our ballots. We rotate our ballots currently, and we don't rotate our absentee ballots, so would that be something that we would want to do for early voting ballots? We also have to consider the recruitment and the training of our poll workers. That's additional, more hiring. The staff costs. The Election Commission at this point is really suffering as far as spaces. So many other offices in the city, and we just can't, we're having a difficult time accommodating early voting, let alone any election, because of the amount of space. Supplies that we take on, the unvoted and voted ballots, ballot boxes, the amount of voters that come. We have them, they're wrapped around the building. Sometimes there's inclement weather. It can be a hazard because people can't get in and out of the building because of the congestion.
You're speaking of 51 Inman Street?
Yes, 51 Inman
specifically,
Street.
yeah.
And we can only have 2 workers in the front because the counter space just won't allow for it. So at times it just takes quite some time for people to be processed.
So these are problems or challenges that you have with early voting for the state elections, correct?
These are challenges for the state election, except for our ballot concerns. Some things that the cost would be taken on by us. The state takes on the cost for early voting for the state. So we would take on our own costs.
Do you have any idea, ballpark, what that could be? And that's assuming, that would be assuming that we did the same schedule, and that isn't necessarily.
Well, for the state, it was approximately $80,000.
And that was
And
for,
that includes poll staff, the early voting location staffing, not my office, early voting location staffing, and supplies for locations, rentals, things of that nature.
And that
doesn't include my office staff, overtime, DPW, the police department.
So saying that it would double would assume that we would do the same number of days as the state elections.
Well, I think that's something that we'd have to consider.
Well, I'm agreeing with you
Yeah.
that it's not.
If you're doing it for 11 days, that'd be approximately. how
Yeah,
much
if you're
it would
doing
be.
it 11 days, but.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Plus, it might be even more because of the type of ballot that we have. The cost for our ballot might be more expensive than the state ballot. We don't have to pay for the state ballot. Yeah, we don't have to pay for that either.
Okay.
Now, we have concern about, the Election Commission has concerns about voters who vote early will have to put their ballots in envelopes instead of through a machine for PR. So that means that they won't have an opportunity to correct it if there's an issue with their ballot. Like they do on Election Day, like an overvote. Sometimes the machine will spit the ballot back and direct you to correct the ballot during PR, indicating what issues may be with your ballot. You won't be able to do that.
So when we vote early in the state elections, we put it in a ballot?
No,
Is
you
that-
put it in an
I'm not in a ballot, in an envelope, you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah, and so that would be a requirement instead of using a machine, is that?
Well, you don't put, the early voting ballots, you can only insert them into the machine on Election Day. You cannot do it prior. So they must go into a sealed envelope, just like an absentee ballot, for security reasons.
I see.
They come back to our office and we seal them in ballot boxes until Election Day.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead. Anyone can ask follow-up questions, because we're all learning about this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm learning as well. So where does this requirement come from? Like logistically, it seems possible to just have the machine and insert the ballot and it would be stored in the machine, right?
No, what? No, this comes from the state law. We're not allowed, that would be, the only time that you can process a ballot is on Election Day.
But also, can I answer? Another issue is that the ballots have to be counted by precinct, and on early voting, all precincts are going to be voting at the same location. So we can't actually have 34 machines set up, one for each precinct at an early voting location, and then they'd be able to put their ballot in the correct precinct. So the ballots have to be in the envelope, labeled with the voter's name and address and their precinct, so that on Election Day, they can be cast in the precinct where that voter lives. So we have no way of putting a ballot through a machine. We don't have different ballots for every precinct, so it's all the same ballot. So for municipal election, it's all the same ballot. So if we were to have a machine at an early voting location, then all the precincts would get mixed together. We can't do that.
Thanks. Just for the benefit of the audience so that everybody understands what we're saying. So you're saying the machine doesn't, the ballot doesn't indicate the precinct, and so the only way to separate the ballots is by having a different machine for each precinct.
Yes.
Well, that is kind of a problem. I mean, technologically, of course, we can imagine ways to solve it, but you're saying logistically right now.
Well,
there's
also
no
under
solution.
state law, we don't have that option.
Right. Okay. I mean, that's clearly a limitation, but it's not a deal breaker. I mean,
No,
if people want to, vote that way and understand that they can't correct their ballot. if
Right.
they do
It's
that.
true in
Yeah.
state elections as well, but in municipal elections, because we have more types of overvotes than we do in state elections, it's just something to be aware of, that voters make a lot of mistakes on municipal ballots. We do have a lot more spoiled ballots in municipal elections than we do in state elections, and that's because people can overvote by giving one candidate two different rankings, or they can overvote by giving two different candidates the same ranking. Those are not overvotes that are an issue in state elections. And so those voters, the commissioners, all those ballots would get counted even if there's a mistake on it, and the commissioners would determine voter intent to the best ability possible. But it just takes away that chance that they get when they vote on election day to correct it right then and there.
Again, there are technological solutions that we can imagine. Somebody could write an app. You would, look at the ballot, and it could tell the voter. We could have ways to produce it on.
The only issue with that is it would have to go through state certification.
Well,
Thing that we create for our elections, even if it's a municipal, must go through, all voting equipment must go through a state certification process.
right. I understand. I'm not suggesting that any of this would be easy or that we could do it tomorrow. I'm just saying, over time, we could imagine other ways that people could check their ballots before putting it in the envelope.
I think we just want to make it clear that the board, myself, the Election Commission, we're not against early voting. As you've seen in the past, we work with it. It's just that we want you to consider, these are just considerations, things to be prepared for, and that obviously it can't happen overnight. It is a process.
No, we understand that, and that's one of the reasons I called the hearing, is so that we could hear about these kind of things, so that we understand better what the logistical challenges of implementing this are. So I'm glad you're giving us this information. So if somebody does, makes a mistake on their ballot and ranks two people the same number or something, the machine spits it out? It does?
Yes.
Okay.
And then at that point, you can correct. You could be given a new ballot, correct your mistake, and reinsert it.
Okay. Do you have any
If it's in
idea?
an envelope and you're
No,
no
I
longer
understand.
there, yeah.
And do you have any rough idea of what percentage of voters do that? No.
No, but quite a few do in our municipal election because of the amount of choices that we have in the process and the way our ballot is set up.
That would affect an absentee ballot as well, right? If you
Yes.
and one of the state bills that we heard also discussed at today's hearing was the no excuses early voting, or absentee, I guess it's called, and that would have the same obstacle, right? You'd have to put it in an envelope, and you wouldn't have any opportunity to
Yes.
correct it. So,
Correct.
okay, go ahead.
Can I ask a follow-up question on the cost? So you said $80,000, but that's not the full cost. And then you said it would be roughly double the current election cost. Can you give us a number?
I don't have a number, but I can tell you we're doubling the cost simply because you have to also have regular municipal election ballots and election day staff. So if you take the cost for early voting, you also have to consider the regular voting. So that's what I mean by doubling the costs.
So what would that number be roughly?
If we're doubling it 160,000 or more,
So 160,000 additional, or are you saying the total cost would be
Additional.
160 additional? Okay.
Possibly.
And in terms of rotating the ballots, so again, just so everybody knows what we're talking about, I think you mean the alphabetical order of the candidate names, and then you're rotating that through the number of ballots. So is there any problem
One has an opportunity to be at
to
the
be
top
at
in
the
each
top?
position. Yes.
Right. Is there any problem with doing that for absentee ballots, or we just don't do it currently?
Well, we don't do it currently, but I don't foresee a
Well, in the past, because the ballots had to be offset print, they actually had to be hand collated in order to get the rotation, so they would print the lot of each type of ballot and then hand collate, so that's been a huge part of the cost of our municipal election ballots. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if we have new voting machines, maybe that'll be improved, that process for this election, but I don't think we know yet. If they can be digitally printed instead of offset printing.
But the voting machines don't print the ballots, so I'm
No,
confused.
the voting machines don't print the ballots, but the voting machines have specs that the printers have to meet in order to have the ballot be read by the voting machine.
And you're
And
saying
we have new
those,
specs for the new machine. I'm not sure whether they allow digital printing instead of offset.
right, so you're saying the standards in the past prevent automatically collating the ballots?
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, yeah.
But for the absentee ballots, you're saying if we have to hand collate those as well, then that would be an additional cost. But again, we could do that.
Yes, it would be additional.
Yeah.
I'd like to welcome Councillor Simmons and Councillor Kelly, who have joined us. I think you get the sense of what we're discussing. Any of my other colleagues have any other questions about the logistics of early voting? Maybe we could talk, now that we've determined that there are a fair number of logistical challenges just with the process of voting. You selected 5 locations, polling locations for the early voting in the state
Yes.
elections, and we heard at least one person suggest that it might be different choices, or that those choices might not be as universally welcomed, being 5 locations that don't neatly tie to certain voter precincts. Would you, I mean, I'm assuming that you picked those 5 locations because they were, geographically dispersed, they were, public buildings, aside from your own public building, which may not be the best polling location anymore, given the space constraints. But, we had the police department, we had the water department at Fresh Pond, I forget the other, City Hall. Was City Hall one of them? No, City Hall wasn't. What were the?
We had the library, main
The
library.
yeah.
The water department.
Yeah.
Police department, and the O'Connor.
Library at Peabody.
The Peabody?
No. Yeah, O'Neill.
I'm sorry, I'm sure, wait, one person at a time. So-
Library. The O'Neill Library.
The O'Neill Library. Okay.
And they were also chosen because we have very limited resources. There's very few buildings that will allow us to utilize their space for 11 straight days.
Right.
And it just is not possible to jump from one building to the next from day to day.
Oh.
So those were the only buildings, that we were able to work with, and they were city buildings, so we weren't charged rental fees or anything like in that nature.
Yeah, and I think
We
those
utilize city
choices,
employees too, so.
I think those choices worked out reasonably well. There seemed to be good participation. I don't know if you're thinking about moving any of them for the next even-yeared election, but
It would be up to the board, but I don't think so, unless there's a reason why they should be moved. People also have the opportunity to vote by mail, so they don't even have to go to those locations.
okay. Councillor Simmons, go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Chair, through to the
Use the
director.
microphone because we're being recorded.
Through you, Madam Chair, to the director and the election commission. Very good to see all of you. I should know this, but I cannot conjure in my mind where the O'Neill Library is. Is that Ringe Avenue? So it's part of the Peabody School?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I did take advantage of early voting. It was a horribly rainy day. No one was there. I loved it. I was in and out in 5 minutes. What did you, just lessons learned, if I may. What did you learn during that early voting period, things that we could have done better? Were there any lessons learned that going forward that you could use to improve? Thank you so much. Improve, number one. And when you look at the vote totals, when there wasn't early voting to when there was early voting, did you see an increase in participation?
No, I don't think there was so much of an increase in participation. I think that it was spread over a period of time as opposed to the one day.
Right.
It made things easier for people. There were positives. If we could have had larger spaces, that might have helped with the amount of people online, pushing them through. And we would have hired more employees, so that would have helped. I also think, looking back just to the beginning with the state law, there were some things that they left out.
Okay.
And
For instance,
protected class voters.
I'm sorry?
Protected class voters, confidential voters.
Okay, so just for those that might be viewing, view later, when you say protected class, could you just spell that out for us?
For instance, someone that has been abused, that has a restraining order.
Okay.
What happens is they're able to become a confidential voter, and they're not identified at the polls. They're only identified by a number, not by their name or address. That was not included in the regulation, how to even process those people.
Oh.
During the public comment period, the state reached out to the city clerk's offices throughout Massachusetts, and that was one of the things that I found. And I mentioned it to them, and it was left out. Wow. And it was already past the point where they couldn't amend it, and they haven't. So you have a whole class of people that haven't even been included in this regulation. We've established procedures in our office to adjust for that. I have them either the choice of coming to my office and seeing me directly and voting, or they can go to any one of the locations with a letter that just has their number on it. But there are things that are left out, and I think that moving forward, that's something that we need to think about is let's look through these regulations, let's take our time and look through and make sure that every voter has an opportunity to vote in the same manner that everyone else does.
Thank you, through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Ford. First of all, thank you, and thank you for having the ingenuity to reach out as someone who has had to deal with women in particular who have had their addresses embargoed and wanting to have full participation and then not being able to because of the fear of being found out or identified in some way. So that's extraordinary that we took that extra step to make that happen. So again, good for us, and thank you for doing that. It's interesting that the state has not figured out how to do that on a larger scale. I mean, for crying out loud. It just seems to be odd in such a progressive state, but I'll leave that alone. So your records show, just one, in terms of lessons learned, the state should have paid more attention to people with embargoed addresses. But what were the other couple of things?
That was just for early voting, though.
For early voting,
They
okay.
do have it in the regulation for regular voting.
But in terms of early voting, were there any other things that in terms of lessons learned that you could share with us so that we know as we advance this conversation?
Maybe not a lesson for myself, but for people that don't actually see the workings on inside of the Election Commission and what goes on. My staff for that, and myself, for 11 days, and the commissioners worked straight through those 11 days and nights. When each of these locations, prior to them opening in the morning, we had to be to work 2 hours in advance. Prior to them closing, 2 to 3 hours in the evening. When we talk about ballots not being labeled by precinct, what we did was my staff actually did it by hand for all of that 17,000 plus ballots. Sorted them by precinct, by street, by house number, building number, so that the poll workers would be able to process them quicker, not quickly, but quicker than they have in the past. It's all a process of learning. It's very difficult. There's a lot of ballots going to these polling locations. And they're dealing with voters that are voting that day, and also trying to process these and absentee ballots.
Right.
So we tried to make the process a little bit easier for them. We also have to get prepared for the next day. Every evening, we load more. We take out the voted ballots, pack those, pack new voted new supplies, things of that nature. So it's a major process. DPW has to break down some of these locations every night because, like the library, it just wasn't, we weren't able to stay in one room. They moved us around because they had other functions going on. So we had Public Works and some of the staff breaking down these locations and moving them to other rooms and buildings.
Excuse me, through you, Madam Chair. So let's take the libraries.
Yes.
So for the O'Neill, Maine, and was there one other?
No, just those two.
Every night, staff would have to.
Not O'Neill, but the Maine, yes.
Right, take all of that, pack it up, put it somewhere, figure
Move it
out
to
in the
another
morning,
room.
and they would, I can't imagine that. I think it's an important conversation because, it's one thing to think about doing something, and there's the other thing about how it is implemented, what it really takes to execute it. Never in my wildest dream did I think that people, and I don't know where all the poll workers come from, I know a lot of them are older, so I can't imagine.
It's hard to find someone to work a full day,
Or wanting to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Absolutely.
To be at a poll at 7, to be fresh and perky and interactive. So I think this is important information. I'm glad you have shared it with us, and I'm glad we asked so that we know when we come up with ideas because this is a city that wants to allow as much community participation, and what larger level of community participation is there but voting, but not really realizing what it takes to make it happen. It's just, we just show up and it's done. So it happens
We also have the police officers at each one of these locations, and so they're not working on the streets or in the city, they're working at these locations. Yes, we can utilize constables, but given security issues across the country, I feel safer with the police department. And they deliver our ballots every day. They pick them up in the morning and deliver them. They stay at these locations all day, even though the state says it's not required, but it's something that we feel more comfortable with.
Yes.
But to say about my staff, that what happens is they work those 11 days and nights and weekend. And then the weekend before the election, they also have to work because we have to sort all of these 17,000 ballots and get the voting list ready, prepared. Monday, we work until 8 p.m., 10 for us. And then the next morning, I'm at work at 5 in the morning. They come in, and we're working a whole day until maybe midnight, 1 o'clock in the next day. So when you're working straight through 11 days with no break, it's grueling.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for doing it, and now I have a greater appreciation of what goes into it. And the last question, and then I'll yield the floor, Madam Chair, is, so you're using libraries, and I know during the general election, we tend to use senior buildings. Would it be easier? Have you thought about perhaps maybe coming out of would it be less cumbersome to maybe use a senior building rather than a municipal building?
Well, it depends on if they're available for that amount of time, 11 days straight.
Yeah.
During a whole day, 12 hours or more each day, and a Saturday, because giving up a community room in a senior center might be, they may need that community space. In addition, CHA, we reimburse CHA for their janitors and their maintenance people and people opening and closing and breaking down. So the board considered that, myself, considered the saving of costs on that end, whereas we're using some of our staff to do it instead.
Go ahead.
The very last. I know I did. The CHA has done extraordinary rehab on a lot of their buildings, and so just to use 237 Franklin for a moment, they do have a room that is not the main recreational room, and so just to put it out there, because I do hear about all the other costs that we inherit by not using a municipal building. I often try to think about seniors and making it easier for them to participate. But again, I say that with some trepidation because I don't want to make a hard job harder, but just something to put there for your thoughts. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield the floor.
And just on that note, we try to consider the seniors also because sometimes the congestion that early voting creates, even on election day, the parking spaces are taken, the entrances are blocked. It makes it difficult sometimes for the people living in the building. But absolutely, I'm sure I'll forward that to the board. I'm sure they can consider.
Just something for consideration. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for this work.
Councilor Siddiqui. Yes.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. So I wanted to start with just talking about the benefits. I think today at the State House we heard a lot about, there's a bill pending about allowing those who are incarcerated or convicts the right to vote. And historically, the access to the polls hasn't been equitable. And so for me, it starts with civic engagement, and it starts with access and equity. I think that's the lens I use. I also totally hear these challenges. Those are real. I think right now, the staff, you don't have the resources, and they're very limited. And I think if we were to do anything, we would want to make sure you had the resources you needed, so that you did not feel unsupported at all. And we'd want the process to be very thorough, because the goal is to have there be more access. I think about the numbers of our municipal election, and I think about what goes into these elections. In 2011, we had about 15,845 people vote. In 2013, it was about 17,743. And then in 2015, there were about over 17,000, I think it was 959 ballots cast. And then it's gone up. In 2017, there were about 22. And I'm so happy it keeps going up. I think it should keep going up, considering how many people we have registered to vote. So for me, it's about, okay, we are a city that prides itself on civic engagement. We often see the same people come to our meetings, too. And I think that having the ability to exercise a vote, it is very valuable. And even on election day in 2017, I had people calling saying, I can't go to the polls, couldn't get out of work in time, I'm so sorry. I was like, of course, I forgive you, it's totally okay. Or it's, too rainy, I can't get out. So giving more flexibility, and understanding that we are in a new wave, I'd say, we are in the new wave of people. I think this is going to happen one day. It's not going to happen tomorrow, probably won't happen in 2019, but it'll happen. And I think as a city, we will have to be creative. And I don't see these challenges as insurmountable. They're challenges. We'll have to work through them. But I think we will be able to figure out the logistics of it. Because the logistics in any plan, they are the kind of the toughest nitty-gritty. But if we can get some answers to that, we can have a good process and figure it out a way how to get to our goal of being a city that makes voting more accessible and gets our voter turnout higher than previous years. So that's what I'll say. I'm supportive of the home rule petition, and I think even if it doesn't pass now, I think it'll keep coming up in years to come.
Thank you. Councilor Carlone.
I do have perhaps two questions. One is, it was mentioned 11 days, but we could make it something different if it's a home rule petition for early voting.
Well, I'm not sure because the home rule that was amended and sent to the state, it mentioned, not this one here. That basically it should be in accordance, it should not be, the bill says that we can set regulations that are not inconsistent with the state law. So
But
I
there
don't
is
know
no state law on local
on EV.
elections. there is no state law. That's my point, and we could send a different version if that's what makes sense. People who can't come on Tuesday usually can come on Saturday. Some countries have a holiday. We're not going to go that far on Election Day. It just seems to me, what is the most appropriate way to begin this? What is more logical? If 11 doesn't work, fine, 5 or 4 or 3, and include weekends. And so part of that problem goes away. Yes, it's a hassle of organizing it, but that's one thing. And the other question that you addressed was asked, did the numbers increase at all with early voting when the state began it? And I believe your response was you didn't think so, but we must have numbers. But clearly it's not measurable, it's not significant, or you would remember that.
Well, I mean, I can tell you that our turnout in 2012 for presidential was about 73%, and in 2016 it's 75%. But every election with presidential is going to be different candidates, different amount of engagement. Statewide, there was, I think, a 1% difference between 2012 and 2016.
So it was only 1%.
Statewide, it was 1%. In Cambridge, it was 2%. And there's a bigger difference between 2014 and 2018, but I don't know that that's because of early voting. That could be the governor's race. That could have been Elizabeth Warren's Senate race. You know, there's different races on different candidates on the ballot and that's the only midterm election we can compare right now. So we only have one presidential and one midterm with early voting. So I don't know that we could say.
There's also the congressional race.
Yeah, and the congressional race actually drove up turnout a lot in Cambridge for, that's a good point, for 2018. So that actually could be why it was 66% in 2018, and in 2014, the midterm was about 49%. And actually, I think a lot of that was the congressional election. But turnout's usually driven by voter interest in the campaigns and the campaign efforts to get out the vote. A lot of studies of early voting throughout the country have not shown a big effect on turnout. Some of them have even shown a negative effect on turnout, and there's different theories as to why, but it does make voting easier for a lot of voters. It does not necessarily increase turnout.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
Through you to my colleague, Counselor. I was hearing what you were saying about if 11 doesn't work, can we reduce it to a lower number?
Because they suggested it doesn't work.
Would you use the microphone, sir, for him?
For those watching at home, I only raised the issue because 11 seemed to be overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And I'll come back. If we're talking about steps in that direction, maybe there's an interim amount that would work.
Right. Through you, Madam Chair, to my colleague. It wasn't a criticism. I'm just putting it out there to say it's more of a query, trying to tease this all out. So we've done it at least once? Twice, thank you. And we've done it 11 days. And I wonder if the consistency speaks to, and I just want your thoughts on this, is if we thought about shortening the life cycle of early voting. I guess what I think about is it would be important that we were consistent. In other words, so if we're going to do it 11 on the state level, will we need to do it 11 on the city level? Because I can see someone saying, oh, I thought you're going to be doing it from X to X. Just something to think about. I mean, I don't disagree. If it's difficult for staff, if you will, and others, for whatever reason, we decided, well, we want to have a shorter window. My thinking is, and I am not wedded to this in any way, is it should be consistent whenever we do it. So if it's 5 days on the state level, it has to be 5 on the municipal, and vice versa. Just some thoughts, Councilor.
If I might respond, Madam Chair, right now it's 0. And so I was attempting to negotiate an in-between number that might work better for the commission.
I want to clarify
Wait,
something.
one
And-
second.
And 4 is better than 0, and that's the point I was trying to make.
Wait, 1 second, Councillor Zondervan. You're motioning, and I'm
I just wanted to clarify.
Yes.
The way that the home rule petition was written, I believe that we have to remain consistent with the state regulation of 11 days. Now, I may be mistaken, City Solicitor's Office can respond, but it says, they indicate in the home rule that we act not inconsistent with MGL Chapter 54, Section 25B. So,
May I
Yes.
ask a clarifying question? Does that state that there must be 11 days?
yes.
That state law says you
Yes,
must,
an
if
early
you're going to
voting,
have,
yes,
so
11 days.
every municipality across the Commonwealth offers the same 11 days? And did the state law also set the hours that you set?
Well, not every state utilized all 11 days, but,
Every city?
yeah, well, every city. For instance, not everyone had evening, it depended on the hours. Not everyone had the same type of hours. Not everybody was open on a Saturday.
Yeah.
But this was 11-day early voting period. You did have that period of time. You could send,
I'm not sure I'm not sure I'm understanding. I understand that this, because I haven't read the state law, and shame on me for not reading the state law, but does it say you may offer an 11-day period and then each city and town can determine which 11 days they want to do it and what
you were
hours?
only required to have, you're only required to have your election office or the city clerk's office wherever you vote. That's the only place that was required to be open by the state. If you chose to have alternate locations, those places had to be open during the same time that regular business hours. So if we are open from 8:30 to 5, those locations had to be open 8:30 to 5. If we're open from 8:30 to 8, they had to be open. But the city, we chose to do extended hours and weekends. Not everyone did a Saturday. Not everyone provided late night weekday hours. We closed at noon on Fridays. We stayed here until 6 on Friday. So that's what I mean. Yes, it's 11 days, but not everyone provided. It's an 11-day period, but not everybody provided the amount of service that we did.
We have Mr. Goldberg from the city solicitor's office. I mean, speaking for myself, I didn't think that our intent in envisioning this was to bind us to doing it exactly the same way that it was done during the state elections. I thought all along we wanted the power to do it from the state, and then we were going to figure out how to implement it because we have we have ranked choice voting, we have, so can you tell us how that drafted, if it really is locking us to doing it exactly the way the state law is?
Well, what I'm prepared to say today is that we will look at that issue, but I do have the language of the Home Rule petition here, which says, as Ms. Ford just said, that the Cambridge Election Commission may promulgate regulations to implement this act not inconsistent with Section 25B of Chapter 54 of the General Laws, et cetera. I think what we'd have to look at is what does not inconsistent mean. It could be that a shorter time period is not inconsistent with that statute, but I don't want to go there absolutely at this point, but that is something we could look at.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Zondervan.
Thanks. And I just want to clarify again for the audience, because we're moving pretty quickly, but not everybody might be able to follow along. So we already have authorization by home rule to do early voting from the state for state and national elections. And I believe that we have a finding from the solicitor's office that also allows us to do local elections. In other words, we're not applying for another home rule to do municipal elections, or are we?
Yes, we are.
We are.
We are.
Okay. So we could, in that home rule petition, as Councilor Carlone suggests, ask for different parameters for the municipal election.
I believe that this has already been sent. The verbiage has already been sent. Is that what the hearing was about today?
It is, but
Okay.
I
But
think that things
as-
can be amended, because I think there was a recommendation that it could be amended. In fact, I think, well, one of your former commissioners, Polly Cobb, came and did recommend that maybe it be amended to also, if there's other legislation pending about the no excuses absentee. So not being a state legislator, I don't know how the sausage gets made once bills come before their committee, but that it's possible we could even ask for it to be amended.
Or maybe it doesn't need, I mean, we still have to figure out what not inconsistent means. It might just mean, like Arthur said, it might just mean that we allow for a period of time, just like the state does, but not the specific amount of time, the 11 days.
Personally, that was my intent all along, but
Yeah.
not having drafted the petition myself. Yes, Councilor Kelly.
Thanks. And similarly, we could have fewer locations because that seems to be at your discretion. So we could do it differently. You mentioned 17,000 ballots in the state and national elections, roughly, came from early voting. And as Councilor Siddiqui gave us some numbers for municipal elections, which is the total ballots are around between 17 to 22,000. So we wouldn't expect, in other words, as many ballots to come through early voting for the municipal election. And so that, again, could influence our thinking in terms of how many polling locations and the hours and all of that sort of thing. I also wanted to ask about the no excuses, basically mail-in voting, and if you could maybe contrast that a little bit with early voting, you know, if we had to make a trade-off, how we might think about that.
I think early voting would have been far easier for everyone in the state to implement if it had just become no excuse absentee voting instead of having a completely different category of ballot with different rules. But that would have required amending the Massachusetts Constitution, so they chose to do it by legislation instead. I think there was actually a lot of confusion among voters. I think every election there's confusion among why is there a difference between absentee and early voting. Absentee, you need to actually have a reason. You need to be away from the city on election day or for religion or disability. One of the biggest problems, I think, with the early voting, the way the state law is written, is that when you apply for an early ballot by mail, we actually can't mail it out until the first day of the early voting period. Whereas if you apply for an absentee ballot by mail, we mail it out a couple weeks earlier because we get the absentee ballots a couple weeks before the early voting period starts. So people who are going to be out of town, if they didn't realize that there was a difference and they applied for an early ballot instead of an absentee ballot, we couldn't mail it. Even if they applied in August, we couldn't mail it until October 22nd, whereas we had the absentee ballots by October 1st or so. So I wish the state had just gone the route that many other states do of having no excuse absentee voting instead of having a completely separate category. I think I think that this is, for me personally, ideally, there would just be no excuse absentee voting by mail or in our office with an office big enough to handle it. And then when turnout, so when there's an election that's going to have a high enough turnout that justifies it, we would have additional locations for early voting during the 2 weeks before, during 1 week before. But that would be, I think, an easier way to do it. But that's not the way the state law was written.
So just to clarify, so you're saying in order to do that, we need to amend the Constitution?
Well, I know that there's a bill in the legislature right now to offer no excuse absentee voting. I think it's just the process requires more steps, but the legislature can do it. I think they just were able to get the early voting that we got passed faster for the 2016 election by doing it the way they did it. But there's a lot, the early voting period ends the Friday before the election, but the absentee voting ends noon the day before the election, so then we'd have people come in noon the day before the election, and if we'd have to find out if they were going to be away the next day or not, and if they weren't, then they couldn't vote, even though there were other people voting absentee. I mean, it's the way that the state wrote the law, though, and I would hope that they would amend it. I had hoped that they were going to make some changes to the early voting law between the 2016 and the 2018 election, but none of the bills that there were to amend it had actually gone anywhere, so it didn't change. Yeah.
If I may ask, so there is the bill H78, which is the no excuses. Is that something that have you looked at that
I
legislation?
haven't looked at it.
I mean, because we could support it, certainly.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
that would simplify your life
and one of the
our
things
life.
I wonder is if Cambridge had and I don't know if maybe Arthur knows this, but if we had a special act for our own early voting, and then the state did something to change early voting so that it was, more like no excuse absentee, or that it was just extended to include primaries and municipal elections statewide, would we still be under our home rule version of it instead of a new state version that got passed for the entire state? I don't, that's something I wondered.
Madam Chair, my feeling is that the special act applicable to Cambridge would apply even if the general law changed.
Okay. Well, I think maybe he can say it again. I think I know what he said, but it's probably better that he say it again so that you understand.
If Cambridge has a special act applicable specifically for the city, we are then not relying on the state law. So if the state law changes and our special act does not, if we don't change it, then the special act would continue to govern.
Just to clarify, though, if our special act says not inconsistent with state law, then the state law changes, then we would still have to evaluate whether we were now inconsistent with the new law.
Could you repeat that, please?
I think we're getting tangled up in. Yeah, I mean, I understand what Councilor Zondervan is saying. If our special act, meaning our home rule petition, gives us the not inconsistent with state law, and the state law changes, we could still be consistent with state law if we wanted to, obviously. I mean,
But we wouldn't have to.
we wouldn't have to, but we're talking, well,
We would have to be consistent with state law, I believe, and
be
so
not
if that
inconsistent.
right, not inconsistent. So if the state law changes, then we would have to be not inconsistent with the new law.
Madam Chair, you mentioned sausage. This is a mess.
It's kind of a mess, and I don't even eat sausage, so.
Madam Chair, we can look at that issue, but one way to construe this would be that we have to be consistent with the general law at the time, as it exists at the time of our special act. Okay. That doesn't necessarily mean if the general law changes in the future that we would have to change what we've done. But we could look at that issue if it comes up.
Madam Chair, just for my edification, because I'm a visual learner, it would be great to see this in writing. So, this is what we do, and this is what the state could do, and this is what we could do, and this is what the state could do. And so to be able to, it'd be easier for me to compare and contrast that as opposed to try to take it in.
I realize it, and all of this is hypothetical because the state hasn't changed this law. So we're really,
down the road.
We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit because they haven't passed the home rule petition. They haven't passed any changes to the state law. So, sorry, it's just.
We're having fun yet.
But I think the big thing that's we're speaking about is the election commission would favor the I forgot what it was, the mail-in for any reason. What was it? No excuse. Yeah, I should know that phrase. And I think that's something that makes a lot of sense. If it makes sense from a workload for them, and it allows anybody, for whatever reason, to do that, that's a win-win, I think, with not having 11 or 4 days of effort. My question is, would you have to come to the office? I assume you would, to pick up that form. Or is it possible to print it right off? You have to somehow
To vote by
correlate
mail?
it with somebody listed, or would you do that after it's submitted?
To vote by mail, we need a written application. Both for absentee and for early voting, we need a request in writing. It needs to be signed, but it can be scanned and emailed or faxed or sent by mail or filled out in person. For absentee, a family member can fill out the application for somebody, but not for early voting.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's 5 o'clock. For some people, that's an important hour. If you need to leave, that,
We could give you a little bit
if you
of-
have, please tell me whatever thoughts you have on that from a implementation or procedural standpoint. Yes.
All right, so 16-year-olds is not public record, so we wouldn't be able to give out lists of candidates. This is regarding the lowering the voting age. Voters under 18 would not be in our state system. We would require our own database, separate from the state's. How we would have to consider how our local voting age being lowered versus federal and state laws. Would there be legal consequences, contradictions between all? Would they also be qualified to run for city council and school committee? Because if we lower the voting age, that's one of the requirements to run for city council. We wouldn't be able to vote, print them on the same voter list. They wouldn't be included in the voter list files we give out. We wouldn't be able to track their voter history. Double data entry, that's just work in the office, which obviously we would do if necessary, but most pre-registrants come from the RMV, when people go to apply for a driver's license, and that's a state database. That information comes to us. So would we need to get approval through the state to access that information, and then in turn register that they're only pre-registering and they're getting their driver's license, but would we be able to, once we receive that information, just go ahead and register these 16-year-olds? Would we need approval from the state and the RMV to use the information for this purpose? Right now we have about 241 pre-registrants. Of those, 172 are RMV. So these were some of the considerations that we had. Didn't want to leave without.
Quick follow-up question. The pre-registration is not 16, though, is it?
Yes.
It is? Okay. So in theory, we could use that information, is what you're saying, that they could pre-register through the state, and then we could use that?
But we would have to have permission.
Right, I mean,
We would have to have permission, plus we'd also have to have permission from the 16-year-old. They may not want to be registered to vote, maybe, for whatever reasons, but
right.
these are things to think about. I don't know.
Right, but we could potentially require that in order to register to vote, as a 16 or 17-year-old, you have to pre-register with the state, and that would be another way for us to get that information through the state rather than having to keep track of it as much on our own. When you say we couldn't track their voting history, you mean, again, through the state systems, but we could in theory have our own system.
Have our own system.
Yeah. Thank you.
But once they registered as 18-year-olds in the state system, their voter history from when they were 16 or 17 won't be in that database, that's all.
One follow-up question. Would we be able, aside from the pre-registration, which happens at the RMV if somebody goes to get a license or whatever, which in this city is, I think, becoming more and more rare. And there's also pre-registration at like the high school or something? Are there sort of where else would people, because you said 142 came from the RMV, so another 100 came from someplace else.
I think there probably have been some voter registration drives at the high school or summer programs or something where kids who knew about pre-registration organized it and submitted a batch of paper voter registration forms all at once to our office. I can remember that happening a couple of times over the past couple of years since pre-registration started.
There's also other things to think about. For instance, students, when they leave to go to college, there could be ramifications of them registering to vote in certain areas based on the financial aid. These are things that we put on our forms, on our handouts when we do voter registration sessions, because sometimes the parents don't want them to change where they vote or even register to vote elsewhere other than their local community because of financial aid. So these are things that have to be explained to, we'd have to find out the legal ramifications, and these things would have to be explained to the students before they go about doing this, because some of the parents might not even know that they're actually registering to vote.
Can I ask a quick question about the early voting? Because I didn't quite hear from you what your preference or recommendation was. I can kind of guess, but maybe if you could state whether is it worth it for us to pursue early voting for municipal elections, or should we focus on the no excuses instead, which I understand still has a logistical implication for you as well, but at least it's harmonized with the mail-in ballots.
And maybe it'd get us a bigger office. I think the no excuses would be something that you might want to pay more attention to. I'm not saying early voting isn't beneficial. It absolutely is, and my office is willing to do whatever we have to do. We think it's a positive thing. We've helped several people, through early voting, and everybody's had a great experience, and we like that, but just the logistics, everything. And I think sooner than later, the state might institute it across the entire state for municipal elections, all elections. So maybe just sitting tight for a minute just to see if the state does it, and then focusing on the no excuse, because it's more beneficial for us. Then people don't have to provide us with excuses and go through this whole thing, and they can vote whenever they want during that period, and we don't have to come up with 3 different voting lists and all of these different procedures, and we can just focus on exactly.
Thanks.
It's just my opinion.
That makes a lot of sense to me as well. I was in Maine last fall, and they have no excuses, and it was just a lot easier to help the voters, to make sure they got to vote.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I have to go.
No, don't apologize.
We have to go to
Thank you for being
commission
here.
meeting.
And that was helpful. I'm glad we did this, and you can watch the rest on tape if you're dying of curiosity about what we say after you leave. Thank you for being here. I think at this point, I will open it up to public comment because we have a number of people, I believe, who would like to speak, and then we can sort of talk about next steps. Yes, Councilor Zondervan.
It may be helpful to clarify, particularly for the younger people, what a home rule even is. So I thought it might be useful to give a quick analogy. It's kind of like asking your parents if you can stay up later at night. Like, you can't just decide that on your own. You'd have to ask your parents' permission. So similarly, we can't change the voting age as the Cambridge City Council. We have to ask the state for permission to do that.
Okay, thank you. So with that, I will open up public comment. We have a few people signed up, and if anyone hasn't signed up and wants to speak, we'll get you at the end. So the first speaker is Robert Winters.
Robert Winters, 366 Broadway. I had sort of been developing a list of things that I was going to say, and actually many of them sort of seem to have hashed themselves out without my even having to say them. But basically, I would have said from the very beginning, you should be going for the no excuse absentee. And whether it's an 11-day window or a 4-day window, to me, it's not so important. Just having the opportunity of a reasonable amount of time and just be consistent with state law. I just think, and I think honestly, to be pursuing anything else is just creating needless complication. I just say, you know, put your investment into what's really the best bet, and then, you know, full speed ahead. Push hard for that bill at the State House, and I'm sure there'll be other cities and towns and people from other cities and towns who'll be doing the same. I was going to mention something about the age 16 voting. I mean, just to say straight up, the case hasn't fully been made to me to convince me that that's really sufficient benefit. But I've always said this about various other proposals that have come up here over the last 25 years, whether it's non-citizen voting or voting in only school committees or whatever, is that I sort of believe voting and election methods. I'm not trying to make a distinction between public PR elections versus plurality elections. Obviously, you have different systems from town to town. But in terms of the basic standards about who should be eligible to vote, I just believe strongly there ought to be a single uniform standard that crosses all city and town lines. And I have never, ever, ever been receptive to this notion that somehow Somerville should be allowing certain people to vote and Cambridge should allow other people to vote and Arlington should have a different set of standard about who should be allowed to vote. If you want to, and it's almost in a sense the same statement I would make about the early voting, is that go up to the State House, make the case, and if age 16 or age 17 is the appropriate standard, convince everybody across the state and do it across the state. You know, if the standard is 18, let it be 18. If it's 17, 17, 16, 16. But don't do it city by city. I just have never, ever found that to be a particularly appealing ideal.
Thank you. Next up is Adam Gould.
35 Rice Street. Thank you for allowing me to speak to you. My name is Adam Gould, and I'm in support of the council filing a home rule petition to lower the voting age for the off-year municipal elections to 16. The facts are there. In a paper by the University of Pennsylvania, Joshua A. Douglas, a professor of election law, voting rights, and constitutional law, said that psychologists are in agreement 16-year-olds are as strong, cognitively speaking, as 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, or anyone else older than them at processing the information necessary to vote. So I find this very interesting because a lot of the blowback has been about 16-year-olds' brains have not been fully developed, and yes, that's true. The brains have not been fully developed. They're just as developed as adults in the parts that needed for voting. And another very convincing argument for me is habit. When people start doing something young, you addressed this earlier, they're more likely to do it again, especially when it comes to voting. People who have voted once tend to vote again, and currently not enough of America votes, in my opinion, and this is a clear way to improve that. And too often people don't listen to people like me because we don't hold any power in the elections. And this would enable us to have a say in our lives and to make people listen, which I think is so crucial in a place like Cambridge with so many transient residents. Having people who have lived here their whole and seen the change, like my sister, this would affect. She's lived here for 16 years, her whole life, and seen my barbershop be turned into an upscale cafe, and seen our local donut shop be closed due to the rent being raised. So when you're 16, you can drive, work, pay taxes, drop out of school, consent to medical treatment, and be tried as an adult. But even with all these things, you can't vote to change the things. And so one of the founding principles of our nation was no taxation without representation. And I'll say I know plenty of 16 and 17-year-olds who have to pay taxes but aren't represented in our democratic process, which makes it harder to call it a democratic one. And lastly, I want to remind you that America got women the right to vote in 1920, And as we come up to 2020, I believe it would be very powerful to follow that example due to the fact that people said very similar things about women, like their brains are not as developed as men, they belong to their husbands, like they say we belong to our parents and our brains are not as developed. I mean, it's different, but like, so yeah. And once they got the right to vote, now women turn out more than men in elections. And so I think this is why it's so important to keep this democracy democratic. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Adam. I like the symmetry with the women's suffrage movement. We've been talking a lot about that this term. Next person who signed up is Brandon Klugman.
Hi, good evening. My name is Brandon. I live at 41 Gordon Street in Boston. I'm here on behalf of Generation Citizen, the organization I work for, that is dedicated to increasing youth civic engagement by ensuring that all students have access to action-oriented civics education that prepares them for lifelong, informed, and engaged citizenship. And we also support the efforts of young people to advocate for 16 and 17-year-old voting on the local level through an initiative called Vote 16 USA, which I lead. We know that Cambridge has a proud history of being a leader on this issue of 16 and 17-year-old voting on the local level, with previous home rule petitions being discussed and debated and sent to the State House over the years. And I think it would be a fantastic way for the city to continue its leadership by doing the same thing this year. Like Adam pointed out, we know that voting is a habit, and 16 is a better time than 18 to build that habit. And the cities in Maryland that have implemented this have seen overwhelmingly positive results. Not only have 16 and 17-year-olds in those cities turned out at higher rates than older age groups, but the council members in those cities have told me that they've seen an increase in interest in city programming and services. They've seen more vibrant discussion around community issues. And they told me, quote, 16 and 17-year-olds are acting like residents. And that's exactly what we want to see. We know that following Cambridge's lead several years ago, several other Massachusetts cities have sent home rule petitions to the state legislature in more recent years. And I think now is the perfect time to bring this issue back to the forefront. It is a little more mainstream now, due in large part to leadership from young people, as well as local elected officials at the state level, and champions at the federal level, like Representative Presley and her colleagues from the Massachusetts delegation, who also are very supportive of this move. So would welcome further conversation on this and would encourage the council to submit a home rule petition regarding municipal voting at 16. And would also encourage folks to support legislation on the state level known as the Empower Act, which would do away with this home rule requirement and would allow cities and towns to lower the voting age on their own if they choose to do so. Thanks so much, and hope to see this go forward.
Oh, thank you. The clerk is saying that if you have comments in writing, you can leave them in the basket, or if you'd like, you can email them to clerk@cambridgema.gov. Is there anyone else out there who would like the opportunity to speak? Yes, come on up. You'll be next. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair. Sam Gebru, 812 Memorial Drive. Just want to offer some reflections on lowering the voting age, in particular to this home rule petition, but also in general to lending support to the Empower Act. So this wouldn't have been the first time that Cambridge is filing a home rule petition for this purpose. I think it's a great idea. I serve as a board member for Generation Citizen Massachusetts, but I'm offering my remarks as a Cambridge resident. I think, a few things. So there's an encouraging wave of youth-focused civic engagement happening right now. In Cambridge alone, since I left Ringe and since Councillor Siddiqui left Ringe, we have a lot more student activism at the high school. It feels like there's a protest and a walkout every week now. There's a lot of energized fervor around civics education right now. Last year, Governor Baker signed the civics bill. Now the focus is on having a civics trust fund to actually put some money behind this to enable school districts to teach civics education and better civics education. Generation Citizen was the leader and still is of this coalition. In addition to that, obviously in Cambridge with participatory budgeting, we allowed 12-year-olds to vote for this particular project. I think, when it comes to enabling 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds to vote in municipal elections, the big factor for me is creating that culture of voting when they're still home. There's a lot of folks, I know I'm speaking anecdotally, but there's a lot of folks in this city, especially young folks, who don't understand our city form of government. Who, quite frankly, don't feel part of this process. And I would like to ensure, and I think you do as well, that they feel like they are stakeholders in their city, particularly before they leave off to do whatever it is after high school. So that's a big part. I was honored a decade ago to be part of this effort, taking the footsteps of Councillor Siddiqui to make this work and to bring light to it. So I think it'd be great if the City Council could forward a home rule petition for this purpose, but also to express the support for the Empower Act. I think that would be the best case solution to actually just allow cities and towns to not have to go through a home rule process, but to do away with that and to allow them to make the laws as they see fit with this. And then just very lastly, also I think when it comes to early voting, no-fault voting, I think is a great way to go. It allows people to vote whenever, certainly I've used that, I think at least once or twice in the past in terms of absentee voting, and if I could make that process less cumbersome for me and for other Canterburyans, especially young ones who leave after high school, that would be a great opportunity as well. So thank you. I don't have any prepared remarks, so I'm not emailing anything, but that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Yes, come on up. If you would like to leave a copy, just
Sure.
one copy in the basket, the clerk can distribute them after.
Copies for everybody.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is William S. Coleman III. Bill Coleman, I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts. Thank you for the invitation of coming down here and presenting. Just to tell you a little bit, in 1976, I worked as an administrative aide to a former U.S. Senator way before all of your time, named Ed Brooke in Washington. And I was a very young, impressionable young man, but Washington was an exciting place. And of course, working with Senator Kennedy and working for Senator Brooke, with Senator Brooke, was an incredible time. So many people got involved in politics. I grew up during the era of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. So we were engaged and couldn't wait to vote. We had to be 21. It was 50 years ago around this time that Senator Kennedy made this speech before the Congress saying that, we have to lower the voting age from 21 down to 18. And the same arguments that people are having today to say we need not to lower the voting age because what do 18-year-olds know? And then we had something called a conflict in Southeast Asia where we were bringing home 18-year-olds in body bags. Actually, we were bringing home 16 and 17-year-olds who had enlisted in the service, through waivers signed by their parents to allow them, and all of a sudden things changed. Now we're at a time in our life where we're having mass shootings in our high schools. We're having different issues around our country, and it's not a question of if they will happen again, it's a question of when they will happen. 2 weeks ago at the State House, I saw a tremendous amount of young people go to lobby for passage of the Promise Act. Some of you may remember Proposition 2.5, dismantling public education in the early 80s. And then in the early 90s, we had education reform under Representative Roosevelt. And that was supposed to resolve the problems that passage of Proposition 2.5 had created. And here we are 25 years later looking at our public education funding, where it's putting homeowner against business and all this, and the ones that are suffering are the ones in our public schools. Now, I'm a retired educator from UMass Amherst, having taught 20 years out there and having taught civic engagement, having taught public policy, grant writing, nutrition. So now, I look at this challenge of whether we should allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. In the city that I live in, Worcester, Massachusetts, and there's an article on the back of this, I went before the city council and filed a petition and asked that they take a vote on it. Well, the vote was defeated 6-5. Now, it'll be reintroduced in 90 days. That's our policy. But 6 city councilors voted against even consideration of holding a public hearing to discuss it. And the reaction from the community was aghast. I mean, how could you not hold a public hearing? Invite young people to come down, express their viewpoint, invite older people to come down and express their viewpoint. Some of this is generational. Some of the older people say, no way, 16-year-olds. But at one time I taught a program called School Age Mothers, SAMS, where we had 12, 13, 14-year-old mothers, in that classroom. And at 14, they were getting apartments through different agencies so they could raise their children. And I've seen and that was years ago, but I've seen some of those young women go on and get their associates, their bachelor's degrees, and their masters, and quite recently a couple of them have gotten their doctorates. And we talk about a school-to-prison pipeline, where I've seen a lot of young men, who could have been engaged. And I commend Senator Harriet Chandler and the state reps and state senators that have pushed for civic education in the schools. I know through 4-H programs around the state, we have done civic education, letting people know. Because people say, kids don't even know there's 3 branches of government. And the first thing I tell, there's 3 branches. You have an executive, a legislative, and then you have the judiciary. And people are fascinated and say, oh, really? I know adults. I mean, in the city of Worcester, we have 108,000 American citizens who could vote in a local municipal election. 12,000 turn out to vote in a lot of municipal elections in the city of Worcester. And we look at Maryland, who in 2013 allowed 16-year-olds to vote in some of the cities and towns. And consistently, the 16 to 17-year-olds have outdone any age group. Now, we look at the 18 to 25-year-olds in presidential elections, we look at a 13% voter turnout. So we look at those challenges. But what Cambridge is doing, and what Cambridge is considering, and I hope you consider it and follow through, is going to lead the rest of the state, along with Beverly, along with Northampton, along with Holyoke. Springfield is considering it. Matter of fact, city councilors from Springfield are live streaming this right now, as well as in Pittsfield. Yeah. As long as in Pittsfield and New Bedford, I talked to some of the state reps who represent the Cape and Barnstable, and they're going to encourage their local elected bodies to consider this. And the challenge should not be to make this more cumbersome for local cities and towns to do this. It would be great to have a state law. If the state law is passed, then right now it's being suggested that cities and towns have the right to buy in. Okay, and that's great. But I just want to tell you, I support, and having taught 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, having taught 16-year-olds, I firmly support, and I've encouraged candidates who don't support it to look at some of those volunteers who are stuffing those envelopes, who are canvassing, going door to door, who are fighting for the environment, who are fighting for public education funding, to see these young people and to support them. Now, with regards to your early voting challenge, there's something called ranked choice voting that is gaining legs in this Commonwealth.
And we use it here. If you could wrap
Sure.
up, we have ranked choice voting in our municipal elections.
Oh, yeah, you have proportional representation voting. Worcester had it from 1949 to 1961, but it was paper ballots. But we're learning from you, and the discussion has been, look at Cambridge. And I think some of the issues that you guys were talking about earlier are not so insurmountable that you cannot, resolve those issues. I just wanted to encourage what you're doing. I hope you vote to support. I hope your home rule petition goes through. I hope you continue to lead the way for the rest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The world is watching. Massachusetts is watching Cambridge. And I'm grateful for this opportunity to be here and to support. And I was very impressed by these young people. And I'll tell you, if you had in the city of Worcester, where every single year we pre-register 600 voters, we have 1,700 students, 16, 17-year-olds, what they call in the queue. And if the law is passed, they're automatically registered voters. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Coleman, for joining us here. Anyone else out there want to speak, or I'll close public comment? Thank you. Okay, public comment is closed. So bringing this back around, I'm thinking that Councillor Siddiqui must be having a case of deja vu all over again, because many of these issues about youth voting were debated twice already, and you participated. Is there anything that you want to add to this? Because you've heard all of these arguments.
Yeah,
pro
and
and against before.
Yeah, and I think I've been where the speakers are, trying to convince current city councilors to move forward. I think the youth are the future. That's so corny, but I do think there are many benefits. It is about creating a habit. You look at the low turnouts in our presidential elections. People move on to a new city, they're not engaged. I think if we can start that habit early, it is very important. And we look at how much civic engagement and the new wave that is happening. I think there's even more a reason now than there was in 2002 and 2006. So I'm still supportive. I think I'm not going to repeat all the reasons because they've been well articulated, but I'm in favor. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Carlo.
I was thinking about what Councilor Siddiqui was talking about, and I realized what a great learning process if you're 16 or 17 and you're taking civics or history class, or maybe even English for that matter, and tying in election issues and having a 2-week session on that. That gets a young mind thinking about what's possible and the importance of the election. It was certainly one of the courses I loved in high school, but it was never related to a particular election. But that really makes it very personal, housing overlay, all the things sustainability, all the issues that people are going to grow up in. And even if they don't vote, it gives them the early bug. So my thought on this has gotten much stronger than before this meeting, and thank you for that.
Thank you. As many people may know, I'm a naturalized citizen. I was naturalized in 1996, and I was very excited to be able to register and vote. So to me, this is a no-brainer. My daughter recently came of age, and she pre-registered, and there's no doubt in my mind that she would have been a very effective voter at 16. And my son has just turned 16, and I think he would be a great voter as well. So it's just a no-brainer that we should do this. I actually agree with Robert Winters. It would be much better if it was uniformly done across the state. And I think we see on many issues that the way to get there is that we keep filing home rule petitions and more cities join us, and maybe we're even allowed to try it first and work out some of the kinks, and then eventually the state gets it done. So I think we should continue to ask for permission, even if we don't get it. and we should also support all these other bills and keep putting pressure to get this done. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Keller, you've been sitting there. If you'd like to speak, you can, but you don't have to.
I'm sort of on the fence on this one. I'm swayed by the advocacy. On the other hand, when I first signed my enlistment papers, I was 17, and my parents had to co-sign for me. So there's a certain element of independence that I associate with voting and other major decisions that doesn't come until you can sign up for the Marine Corps on your own. And that's not dispositive, but it's there in my mind kicking around. So I don't have a vote in this committee anyways, but I don't know where I wind up on this. I certainly think there are many other ways people can get involved besides voting. I had a campaign manager who was 16 a few times ago, and I won. I've always had kids who are under 18 helping me win, so it's not like you have to sit on the sidelines just because you can't vote. So it's certainly worth a discussion. I just don't know where at the end of the day I wind up. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming and listening. I mean, I agree that one of the strategies in using home rule petitions is to, do what Cambridge has done in many instances, the plastic bag bill, other things. Even recently, the cycling safety ordinance has been cited as a model that other cities and towns can follow. And given the fact that there is this Empower Act before the state legislature now, it could be helpful in bolstering that if cities like Cambridge step up and say, yes, we want this. That could help put some pressure on the state. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't. As Councilor Siddiqui knows, sometimes you give them something and they, in their wisdom or whatever, they reject it. So I don't think we have a lot to lose in submitting a home rule petition. So I am certainly game to do that. If that's the sort of thought of this group, we could have that be an order coming out of this committee report and get the rest of the councilor to weigh in about whether we want to ask the law department to actually draft such a thing. So I think that's certainly one action. I think in terms of supporting the no excuses absentee ballot bill that is before the state legislature, that certainly seems like an easy resolution to put in, and I'll work on that and get the support of the people who've been here. And support, expressing support for the Empowerment Act, aside from doing our own home rule petition, also seems to be a logical action. So on those three ideas, do I have a vote that we should offer our opinion that it's worth doing a home rule petition for youth voting to the full council for consideration with a report, and I'll draft resolutions to support the two state bills. All in favor? Is that, yeah? If you were a member, okay. So I guess I've got just you. Are you who's member? You're a member.
I believe so.
You have your membership card?
Yeah. I am in favor. Just procedurally, do we include doing these resolutions, or do you just do that?
I think I can just do those faster than our poor overworked clerk can do a committee report. So I'll do that, and I can ask you to, and Councilor Carlone, if he would like to be a co-sponsor, that makes four. And
so the order is to file the home rule petition for lowering the voting age.
Yes, in the committee report, yeah.
So, right.
Yes. So to ask the law department to carefully draft the home rule petition that is not inconsistent, or use some language that we know what it means, so we're all clear on what we're asking.
We trust the clerk to do that work for us. I'm a yes, emphatically.
And the other thought that I have is we have talked about a youth town hall. That has come up as a way of getting young people involved. I don't know. I think it was going to be left to the youth policy council, if that's their current name, to determine what they were going to talk about, but maybe this is an issue among other things that they would want to talk about. So you can, Councilor Siddiqui, if you are leading that initiative, as I think you might have been.
I can follow up with, I think, the sponsors of that order. I think.
I can't remember who that was.
The Department
Was
of
it-
Human Services is going to be working with the Cambridge Youth Council, so we can certainly bring that up.
Okay. I mean, just a thought. And in terms of just one final thought, in terms of civic education, I think obviously that is all part and parcel of this. And I remember putting in a resolution to support a state bill 2 years ago, probably now, that was to make civics education mandatory in public schools. So it's certainly something that the council has supported all along and continues to support. Okay, well, thank you all for being here, participating, and I guess the meeting's adjourned.
Hey. Brandon. Brandon's Bill Coleman. Great to meet you, Bill. What's your name again? Adam Warren. We'll put it like this, you guys had
So how did things, I read the article, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, Worcester County Company, we got to bring it up.
Okay, okay. And that was just asking them to support Chandler's bill?
Ask them to have a public hearing. Okay. Yeah, you know, but feel free to invite me out, you know?
See you off stage, my friend. You speak really well. Take care.
All right, take care. But feel free to invite me out.
Yeah, we'll do it
I'm
here.
traveling around the state.
Okay, wonderful.
I'm
So-
traveling around the state. Springfield, I sat in their city council.
Wonderful.
And I listened, and I know there's a state, the vice mayor out in Pittsfield is very interested.
Great,
And
great.
so I'm looking at different communities around the state. to
Wonderful.
say, hey, listen,
Thank you.
know, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, and we're here, I mean, working here, we're